Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to be bringing everyone this next installment in our Fair Trade Month webinar series to go into a bit of a deep dive on how fair trade can help solve for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, really across the majority of those 17 goals that the UN has laid out for 2030. And very excited to have two speakers with us today to talk more about those details and with much more knowledge and background expertise than I have to share. So, well, joining us today on our webinar, we have Sergi Corbalán, who leads the Fair Trade Advocacy Office. It's a joint political advocacy office of the World Fair Trade Organization and Fair Trade International. Sergi is a lawyer by training, and he has 18 years of experience with public policy advocacy on trade and sustainable development issues. Also with us today, we have Parker Townley, the Senior Manager for Coffee at Fair Trade USA. He supports roasters, importers, retailers, and brands seeking to deliver on sustainability goals and communicate the impact of their fair trade sourcing. He's also currently working to support the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, which is a cross-industry collaboration, and he's leading up a group, the Sourcing Action Network, that builds resources and offers support for companies seeking to make ambitious, sustainable sourcing commitments. So we'll start with a big picture view of fair trade and the Sustainable Development Goals from Sergi, and then do a bit of a deep dive into the coffee industry with Parker. So with that, I would like to welcome Sergi and turn things over to him to kick us off.
Thank you, Susie, and thanks for the invitation. Can you hear me well?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Excellent. So greetings from Brussels in Belgium to our American friends. Happy to be with you today. And I was very pleased to receive this invitation from the Fair Trade Campaigns team. So I'll briefly introduce myself and our organization. Then I'll like to talk about the relevance of fair trade to the SDGs, or to the SDGs to fair trade. And then I'll talk about some questions about how to make sure that the SDG implementation is a good implementation that supports fair trade. Just before I go to the SDGs, so I want to introduce what the Fair Trade Advocacy Office is. So we are a joint political advocacy office of the two main global fair trade networks, in particular Fair Trade International and the World Fair Trade Organization. These are, or I would say, the pioneer global fair trade networks, and in 2004, they thought that it would be important to set up a public policy lobby advocacy office in Brussels. Why in Brussels? Because it's the headquarters of the European Union, and therefore in Europe, at least, it is a very important place. It's like Washington, let's say, but for 28 EU member states. So our main mandate is to advocate for policies at EU level, in support of fair trade, in support of a fair implementation of the SDGs, in support of more balanced supply chains. I'll go deeper a bit later. We also serve as kind of a lab, or as a forum for exchange of good practices in advocacy of the fair trade movement globally, right? So we try to organize capacity building trainings for fair trade actors in the global south, in Europe, and in other continents, to exchange and learn from each other and see how we can work better together on to advocate for fair trade. And I came across, I work quite regularly with Billy, in particular in the context of the International Fair Trade Towns campaign, which is the kind of the international version of your fair trade campaigns, trying to promote an uptake at local level of fair trade, involving local groups, local authorities, etc. So this is who we are, and happy to ask questions after about ourselves. But you know, unfortunately, as much as I would like to, today I'm not talking about myself, so I'm going to stop my ego trip and I'm going to talk about fair trade and the SDGs, which is my job to do today. So if I can move on to the next slide. And yeah, so this is a selection of the most relevant SDGs. When we talk about SDGs, what is that? Well, so 3 years ago, the United Nations and the members of the United Nations, including the US government, all the Europeans, Asians, Latin Americans, etc., agreed on a number of 17 goals with sub-targets. So a long list of, I think, over 160 commitments that we collectively, so all the governments around everywhere, we should try to achieve by 2030. And so basically giving ourselves as humanity, let's say 15 years to achieve them. They replaced the Millennium Development Goals. You may have heard about these objectives, which were very poverty reduction oriented, and they were mainly applicable to the southern countries. So it was like, let's make sure that malaria is eliminated, these health issues, etc., etc. So it was about the North giving money and in order to achieve change in the South. I'm a bit simplifying, but well, just so that we understand each other. Whereas this new model, the Sustainable Development Goal, it's kind of a merge of the environmental agenda of the UN with the poverty reduction agenda. So it's not only about poverty reduction, it's not only about environmental protection, but it's about both. And we believe it's a good thing. So there are 17 of those. And of those 17, I have highlighted here in the screen the goals. This is the general title of the goal. Then, of course, you would need to go much more in detail. There are as I said, targets and indicators. But in general, it's obvious that it is a good thing that the global community agrees on collective goals for all of us to achieve by 2030. And they are very similar to our objectives of fair trade. When you look at SDG 1 of no poverty, obvious. I mean, this was from the outset. Fair trade is a pro-poor trading partnership, right? So this was all about this. About hunger, obviously as well. I think that it's clear that the trading terms of fair trade offer an alternative to being hunger. It also has to do with good health and well-being. It also has to do with gender equality. It's clear that women have more opportunities under fair trade, and they have equal pay and access to fully participate in the decisions. So I think that basically fair trade contributes to SDG 5. It also contributes to 8, for example. I mean, 7 is relative, to be honest. I think that 8, decent work and economic growth, this is very important. It's clear that fair trade principles and fair trade working conditions contribute to actually being able to have decent working conditions and to make a living. It also talks about SDG 11 about sustainable cities and communities, where again relevant. It's obvious that, as I was discussing before, the good job you're doing in your own communities, in your own cities in the US shows that it is very important to localize fair trade, the SDGs, and fair trade can be a very useful tool to localize the SDGs at local level in terms of cities and communities. Obviously, it is fair trade is super relevant to SDG 12, which is about responsible consumption and production. I like saying the other way around. I like it more responsible production and consumption, because fair is you produce and then you consume, right? But it's clear that this goal includes very interesting commitment when it comes to promoting awareness raising about the ability of consumers to make a choice with their consumer choices. But it also talks about public procurement, which is basically the power that governments have in choosing for certain products and services that they buy for schools, for hospitals, for many uses. So that's an important part as well of SDG 12, and that's very relevant for fair trade and fair trade towns. Obviously, there is the climate change action goal that is also relevant to fair trade. We know that fair trade farmers, small farmers more generally, are often among those most affected by the negative impacts of climate change. And obviously, and fair trade is about promoting sustainable farming practices and giving tools and income to help address the negative impacts of climate change, like pests and other of such negative impacts. And then, I mean, 16 to a certain extent, but I would highlight SDG 17, which is partnerships for the goals. So what the UN said and government said, yes, it's all about achieving the 16 goals, but it's not about everybody doing their own thing. It's about working together, and that meant private sector, the government, civil society, trade unions, NGOs, etc. Right? Can we go to the next one? Yeah, this is another way of looking at it. So we came with the idea that when it's about localizing fair trade, we also chose the 9 most relevant SDGs, the ones that I've been mentioning basically, and we did it like in a Rubik cube kind of image. And as you can see, we identify these arrows in green and blue around it, indicate that fair trade is a very useful way for whom? For businesses, for local government, for citizens, for schools, and for universities to achieve the SDGs. So through fair trade, these actors in green can actually achieve the SDGs, in particular these 9 ones. How? Well, if you look at the arrows in blue, you will see, welcome, you will see that they can do it through public procurement, through international cooperation, like the twinning of cities of one city in the US with one city in Latin America, for example. They can do it by multi-stakeholder engagement. I mean, basically, the steering committee of the Fair Trade Towns campaign is a good practice about how civil society works with the local authorities. They can also do it through awareness raising. So fair trade is a very useful way to raise awareness on the SDGs. And they can do it also by link with the local economic development agenda. I know, of course, better Europe than the US, but so the city of Ghent, for example, in Belgium, is a very good practice about how the fair trade agenda can be linked to the local economic development agenda. So Ghent is a city that used to be a textile and manufacturing city, and they thought, and that was in decline because basically they moved on to other cheaper places. So the city thought we need to promote entrepreneurs in fashion, in ethical, so fashion designers, etc. So the city thought, why not also promoting ethical fashion chains in line of their commitment to fair trade? And they've been really doing a great job in giving tools and supporting the local fashion designers to source themselves from fair trade sources, basically, in cotton and in other fibers. So which is an example about how using fair trade, you can actually achieve various SDGs, and also how you can also make a link with a local agenda, your local economic agenda, not only something that comes from far. Yeah, can we continue to the next? So basically, the implementation of the SDGs, it all depends on, it's basically commitments by governments. It's not a law. It's not it's not an international treaty. So it would be difficult legally to hold a government accountable for meeting or not meeting an SDG, unfortunately, maybe, but it is so. And but there are some processes at the level of United Nations where the countries need to report on what they are doing, and they are therefore scrutinized in this way. The SDGs are also important for the private sector. I've been talking a lot about governments because governments basically negotiated these goals, adopted these goals, and promote these goals. But companies, of course, they also find that the SDGs can be a very useful frame. Now, there are many initiatives actually at least in Europe about companies committing to the SDGs. Now, what we see is that very often they are a bit modest, like, you know, let's imagine that a company is good in certain practice of, I don't know, recycling of materials. Well, they will say that they contribute a lot to a certain objective, which is true, a certain goal, but then they wouldn't then take it a step further and say, okay, but in reality, if I want to be a true defender and implement the SDGs, it's not only about what I'm already doing well, it's about challenging the buying practices, the operations of my supply chains, both at home and abroad, and being, using the SDGs as an opportunity to improve all throughout the board, all operations, right? This would be a good implementation of the SDGs. Now, I think that to start the discussion, not to stop it there, I think, obviously, as I said, we are very positive about the SDGs. Of course, how could you not be in agreement of these goals? However, I guess that there are some questions that we ask ourselves and we need to bear in mind when we discuss whether there's a fair or not fair implementation of the SDGs. So questions like, is it possible to have sustainable supply chains if they are not fair? So let's say that, why do I ask this? Because the accent is on sustainability. Now, of course, the problem with the word sustainability is that it also means so many things that you don't know anymore what you're talking about. Now, sometimes sustainability is interpreted as, well, let's put these norms, let's put these environmental standards, let's put this labor or worker protection laws, and then let's make sure that these products meet these requirements. That's often a bit like that. But we say that's not fair, because if we only are, if sustainable supply chain is only about the buyers saying to the producers, you need to meet this, this, and that, then, well, we are actually perpetuating a power relationship where the buyers decide and the producers, they need to respect it if they wish to sell. So what we see very often is that companies claim to support the SDGs, but and they say, yes, we want our supply chains to be fully sustainable, we want our producers to be green, not to have child labor. But then when you look at the way they treat their suppliers, when you see the way they pay their suppliers, actually they don't change their practices. So therefore the SDGs could easily be used, unfortunately, by some as a kind of a smokescreen that makes them look good, but doesn't mean a transformational change. And this is not the fault of the SDGs per se, so this is not a critique to the SDGs, it's about kind of an unfair interpretation of the SDGs. And we believe that, therefore, we should try to avoid this kind of interpretation. So other questions that we have when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals links to public procurement. I'm not aware of the exact amount of public procurement that is done in the US. In the EU, there is an average of 15% of the global gross domestic product of the EU is spent by governments. It may be a bit lower in the US, I do not know about that, but nevertheless, it is an important lever to change practices of companies. And we believe, therefore, that public procurement should be possibly the first policy change that should happen at local level or regional level, state level, federal level. If a government is pretending to support the SDGs, in our view, the first thing that government should do is to change the way they buy themselves when they buy products or services. And if you're serious about the SDGs, therefore, all public procurement should introduce in a way or the other sustainability criteria. Otherwise, to be honest, you're not really serious about the SDGs. It can be done in a gradual way. This is not about saying that things can change from night to day and there are always practical problems. But in terms of direction, we advocate for commitments for governments to say that by 2030, all their public procurement should be sustainable. And last but not least, we also are asking ourselves whether we should be advocating for a concept of due diligence for fair supply chains and sustainable supply chains. So, and make it like a mandatory due diligence concept that all companies should adopt. So due diligence is a concept that is used in business circles, and some people talk about human rights due diligence, but we say, you know, every company should do a risk assessment about the possible risks that in their supply chains there's some unsustainable practices, poorly paid farmers, risk of hunger, risk of marginalization, and every company should be obliged to take measures to reduce the risk of this happening. So these are some, and this concept of mandatory due diligence for sustainable supply chains would, in our view, take the SDGs a step further. So the SDGs are very nice, but they are a bit voluntary. And we believe that companies should be pushed to meet the SDGs and to take it seriously. To conclude, maybe last slide. So our plans are to develop this concept of due diligence for sustainable and fair supply chains. Because a lot of people talk about human rights due diligence, but we say yes, but we should make sure that we have sustainable supply chains. What is the difference? Take the topic of child labor, for example. It is very easy to say, oh, as a consumer, I want all my chocolate to be child labor free. That is a typical consumerist agenda approach. It is a legitimate expectation, but then you only look at the problem from the side of the consumer. Whereas we believe that we should be looking at more like, yes, of course, we want children, the daughters and sons of farmers in cocoa fields to be able to go to school. Obviously, we want that. That is the objective. But rather than penalizing those farmers that still ask their children to help, we should instead looking at the way they are paid, how much they receive, how strong they are, and to take them out of poverty through trade, which is the mission of fair trade. And this will then automatically result in them not having use to child labor, basically. So because of this, we believe that it's important that all companies not only say that their supply chains are sustainable or that their supply chains are human rights violations free, but that they actually change the way they behave in terms of procurement practices, contracts, partnerships, how they buy from farmers. And to conclude, step 2, obviously we also want to support and encourage the Fair Trade Town campaigns globally to advocate for a localization of the SDGs through fair trade. And we have some tools and good practices that we can share. And ideally, for those that are interested, we would also like to advocate together for an ambitious implementation of the SDGs. And as I was saying, an ambitious implementation of a due diligence concept for sustainable and fair supply chains. So these are my thoughts at this stage. I leave it now to you. I've seen that there's questions and answers at the end, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Sergi, for that background and all that useful information that you just shared with us. A lot to think about in there. And for questions and answers, we will absolutely have some time at the end to get into questions from anyone here in the audience. And so now I'm happy to turn things over to our second speaker and welcome Parker Townley to talk to us more about fair trade and the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the coffee industry.
Hi, everyone. For those who don't know, I'm Parker Townley. I used to work on the Fair Trade Campaigns team, so very, very familiar, obviously, with the world of fair trade towns and fair trade colleges and universities, and excited to talk through a very exciting initiative in the world of coffee, and specifically how fair trade fits within this larger industry initiative, and how we're incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals into that framework. Before I get going and discussing the actual initiative of concern today, I think it's worth reviewing the state of the coffee industry at a global level. Because if you're talking about solutions, you need to understand the challenges and the problems that you're seeking to address first. So two major items. One is around the fact that there's increasing global demand for coffee. Consumption is increasing, especially in East Asia, and especially among younger consumers. And there's been a rise of different types of coffee products that are out there in the market. So you might have been seeing things like cold brew coffee in your supermarkets. So that's increasing the demand for coffee. At the same time, climate change is threatening production and increasing costs for the farmers. So what does this mean? It means that over the next 40 years, by 2050, we're going to have to produce an extra 4 to 14 million tons of coffee each year. And for coffee producers, that would mean having to triple their production by 2050 in order to meet that growing demand. And if you just stayed at the same productivity and essentially just took over new land to convert over to coffee cultivation, that would be an area at current productivity levels 4 times the size of Costa Rica. So obviously there's huge issues there in terms of what that would mean in terms of deforestation potentially, as well as impacts on climate change. Meanwhile, for farmers, at the same time, they're facing a really dire pricing crisis. Coffee is traded as a commodity on international markets. It's been that way since 1989, when essentially there used to be like a world coffee trading scheme that fell apart at that time, and the free market took over, and that's actually where fair trade really got its start as a certification and labeling initiative, was to support coffee farmers as they went through a dip where coffee and the price paid for coffee wouldn't cover their cost of production. So they were losing money with every bag of coffee that they sold. And so you can see here, I've pulled together a graph that shows the huge volatility of the coffee market. It can really like swing really high upwards above $2 per pound. And at the moment it's down below $1 per pound. And at that price, it just doesn't make sense for farmers to continue moving forward into coffee production. And that's why fair trade as a system has a minimum price. You can see that superimposed there to guarantee, it's almost like an insurance mechanism, so that farmers can be able to at least earn $1.40 per pound for the coffee that they're selling, plus an extra 20 cents for the fair trade premium, the community development premium. So that's a look at just like, where is coffee at this moment? There's obviously been a lot of effort in the world of coffee around sustainability. And over the years, that's taken a lot of different shapes and forms. I'm going to speak specifically to an effort to take all these different initiatives and bring them together. It's called the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. So this is an initiative that was formed about 3 or 4 years ago at the Paris climate conference. And it was done so by a range of NGO actors, industry actors in the coffee industry, as well as some governmental organizations. And the challenge that they've put on themselves is to pull together an organization and a movement that will help to be a catalyst for making coffee the world's first sustainable agricultural product. And that's 100% sustainable in terms of the entire industry is incorporating elements of sustainability into how they do business. So that's a very like grandiose goal, and it's very aspirational and very much about how we can take where we are today and move to a much better future. How do we do that? So the Sustainable Coffee Challenge focuses on strengthening demand. So by working with all of the different players in the sector, that you can increase the demand for sustainability in the coffee industry and drive more collaboration forward. And the idea is if retailers and brands and all of the different customers that buy coffee make demands for sustainably sourced coffees, that will lead towards a greater amount of coffee being purchased on those terms. Because at the moment, if you look at it, about 40 to 50% of coffee in the world is actually produced against some kind of certification standard, whether or not that's organic, fair trade, or Rainforest Alliance. But less than a quarter of all that coffee that's produced against the certification is actually purchased against that certification. So that means there's a lot of farmers doing a lot of work, but not necessarily receiving the benefits. So this initiative is really focused on trying to bridge that gap. They have developed the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, and as I said, Susie said earlier, like am volunteering to support this initiative. Has a compass that helps to identify what are the desired impacts. So we have 4 big buckets. One is around improving livelihoods. The second is around sustaining supply, making sure that there's coffee now and in the future. Meeting market demand for sustainably produced goods, and conserving nature. So those are 4 very big buckets. How does the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, how does that fit within the framework of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge? Really, it helps to provide common language and guidance to understand collective impact. So what works and what doesn't. So that way, if you have folks that are saying, I have built my own internal program at a company, does that actually deliver the same amount of impact as if they were participating in a more movement-based approach like fair trade? So since coffee is such a keystone commodity that impacts millions of people, and as we could see based off of the land use issues, the entire planet, the Sustainable Coffee Challenge has mapped the SDGs against the activities of the coffee industry. And so you can see there's this graphic that shows where are the areas that coffee as an industry has the greatest impact, and where does it have a little bit smaller. So you can see like some of the coffee beans are bigger than other coffee beans superimposed over the graphic. It's just a creative way to show like coffee, since it's such a major economical force, does focus very heavily on like there's heavy opportunities around decreasing poverty, for example. And so I think this maps pretty well with what we were hearing from Sergi earlier. And so that's just a look at like for the entire coffee industry, if we looked specifically at who we within the fair trade movement dedicate a lot of our energy and focus around supporting coffee farmers, how would the SDGs specifically match to that one of those 4 buckets, that prosperity and well-being for farmers, workers, and our communities? And so the Sustainable Coffee Challenge and the work that we've done, we've pulled out 6 SDGs and noted like some examples of how coffee can and some outcomes that we could focus on to deliver to each one of these different goals. So for example, under good health and well-being, the focus or a measurement could be around increased access to medical services. For quality education, a measurement could be around increasing access to education. And so really just trying to have an understanding of like, where are the different areas that we can create metrics and measurements so that we can be able to make comparisons between all of these different intervention methods. And then if we look specifically at standards and certification, and I apologize, this can get a little bit complicated, but we've actually identified what are the different enabling conditions that need to be present for us to be able to move forward if we're looking at standards and certification like fair trade. as a way to deliver against these goals? What are the types of investments that are being made via that pathway, the actions that can be taken, and then the corresponding outputs, which is focused on like just like pretty broad based of like where are investments happening as well as like who is benefiting, and then focusing on outcomes, and that's focused on like what you want to achieve, and then finally impacts. And this is where you can see on this final column that they're each tied to one of the SDGs. And that's really, again, focused on how do you measure. So you can be able to start broad and have a good understanding of how this flow of activity and action can lead to real impacts on the ground. And that's where we tie everything into the SDGs. So if you're looking at improved labor conditions, then that might focus on, that might lead to improvements around improved farmer and household income, or improved working conditions, which would be under SDG 8. So that's kind of how like we've been building out some of the work for the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. I should note that this is sourcing has been probably the largest of the different areas that organizations make commitments. The way that it works is that a range of different organizations have come together, and they're all taking a look at their present activities and efforts, and then reviewing what that looks like now, and then identifying ways to go above and beyond that, create a public commitment saying like, hey, 3, 4, 5 years from now, here's where I want to be. Like, I want to make a commitment to a certain amount of my sourcing or my practices as an organization being on like sustainable, and what does that mean? Providing that definition as well as the different things that you're going to measure. So this is really helpful for helping organizations, different companies understand exactly what they should be tracking to make sure that at the end of the day, the impacts that we are trying to achieve are actually happening on the ground. A look at who is actually involved in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, because you may be asking, thinking about that. This is just an overview of some of the organizations that are now part of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. I should note that the Sustainable Coffee Challenge is in partnership with a group called the Global Coffee Platform, which is kind of like a mirror organization that's been doing a lot of good work in Europe and is focused a little bit more on policy rather than direct of engagement with the business community. So this is just a look at the different brands, nonprofit organizations, governmental organizations that are all coming together to create individual commitments themselves, but also reach across and build commitments with each other. And part of the value of this specific initiative is the fact that we can actually have one place where we can see all of the different initiatives that our people are doing. So that way we can find better efficiencies in terms of seeing that someone may be working in the same region that you are. And so why wouldn't you reach out, start a communication, and potentially turn that into a partnership moving forward. And I've included 2 examples of what companies are doing specifically and what their actual commitments look like. So you see that McDonald's is on here. They have made a commitment to sourcing 100% of their coffee as verified sustainable coffee by 2020. That may make you question, what does verified sustainable mean? And that's a great question. And McDonald's has, like every organization, they've created a definition. So for them, that means all their coffee needs to be sourced either through Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, and that's either Fair Trade USA or Fair Trade International, or through, it has like any vendor that they work with has to go through essentially like a third-party review process with a series of stakeholders that essentially says that you are either meeting the standards or are reaching like a similar level as what Rainforest Alliance or Fair Trade would be achieving on the ground. So it's very like focused on that outputs and outcomes side of things. Meanwhile, S&D Coffee and Tea, this is a major coffee roaster in the United States. They've committed to 150 million pounds of sustainable coffee through RIEs, which is their own internal sustainability program, and through certifications. And for them, that includes Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade. So again, the focus here of this specific group is on increasing demand for sustainably produced coffee. And then my final slide, I'm just going to share what Fair Trade USA is currently pulling together. And this is a little bit of a sneak peek. We as an organization don't source any coffee. We don't buy anything ourselves. So for quite a while, we are trying to determine what our role was going to look like within the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. So this is what we landed on, was actually the idea of facilitating and pulling together a joint commitment where different coffee companies, brands, retailers, cafe retailers, they can be able to leverage the fair trade system to be able to make their own commitment to the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. So we're working with groups right now to help them determine what their commitment looks like, and it can be one of these 3 options that you see below. That might be converting something from a conventional product to become a fair trade product. It could be increasing the amount of volumes that they're purchasing on fair trade terms, or it could be focused on education of their own employees or consumers. That third one has to be in conjunction with the first 2, because it's not enough to simply talk about something. You need to meet it with some kind of actual behavioral practices and changes within how you do business as a company. And then what we're going to do is we're going to work with all those organizations to help them compile what that looks like. And if, say, we work with 20 or 30 different organizations, then we'll be able to say between those 20 or 30 organizations, there's going to be an extra 5 or 10 million pounds of fair trade coffee purchased 4 years from now. And what does that mean for farmers? And what does that mean in terms of increases in income or increases in assurances around the increased scope of fair trade as a system? So that's where we're going to be doing a lot of work to be able to gather some of the metrics that are associated with the SDGs. So that's just like kind of some of the ways that all these things plug into each other. That's it from me, so I'll hand it back to Susie.
All right, thank you very much, Parker, and thanks again to Sergi for all of that information that we just heard. Really appreciate all of that insight, and I am sure there are some questions coming out of that. So we have about 10 minutes or so here to open up the conversation and the discussion, and would love to hear what's on your mind.
Susie, this is Kylie. We do have one question in the chat that I would put out to Sergi from Olga Borquez. The question is, we have seen that the projects our employees' fair trade committees have strongly align with the SDGs, but these are their projects and not the companies. So we want to take account of these and measure them, but aren't sure how to approach this without impacting the committee's decision making. How would you recommend we approach this?
Hey, Sergi, are you feeling good on answering that question with us? I don't see your video on there, but hopefully you heard the question come through from Kylie.
It's such a tricky question that I was hoping that I would have the excuse of a technology problem. So you're saying our employees' fair trade committees, do you mean, just to make sure I understand, in case we use different terminology, is this what do you mean? Is it fair trade committees of the fair trade workers in plantations, or are these the committees of fair trade towns in the US? So that I understand.
It seems to be the committees of fair trade workers, but Olga, if you want to clarify that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I hadn't realized I was on mute. So we are kind of aligning the company with the SDGs, and we've seen that the committees, so the people that work in the farm and that are the committee, they have projects that really align with the SDGs, such as scholarships, like like diners for kindergartens and for schools, and the other projects that we would like to be measuring the effect that it has on the SDGs. But we are not sure how to measure these because they're not our projects, they're their projects. So we don't want to take, we want to make sure that we are not taking their wins and like share them as ours, but we also don't want to affect their decision makings by telling them, hey, you know what, you have to do this, like you have to join the SDGs and like do this. We just want to make sure that we're not interrupting the cycle. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So no, I think it's very interesting, and I think that and it's great that you ask yourself these questions, because I think that the devil is in the details in the SDGs, or rather that the implementation is very important, right? And you're right to say that it's not because you have pressure from the public or from whoever in the US or in Europe or whoever, that then that needs to translate in actually demands of fair trade producers needing to take up this or that. So I think it's a very legitimate and very good question. I mean, because I do not know your company, I can be cheeky and provocative, but I would say the first thing that you should do is to pay them well. Because actually, if they have a living income, obviously that will enable them to have a sustainable livelihood, and that is possibly the best way to achieve the SDGs, right? Now, I do think that in fair trade, the ability to be able to decide together on how you use the fair trade premium is, of course, something that workers and farmers want to keep. I think it's right. However, I mean, I do not see it necessarily as a contradiction, because if you see all the SDGs, I mean, most of the decisions, most of the investments that I know of that fair trade committees decide to invest the money on are somehow, I mean, linked to the SDGs, right? So I think it's not about the what, because they are likely going to come up with ideas that are linked to the SDGs. But you're right about, it's more about the how, and how you can maybe, your role could be maybe that once they decide what is that they want to do, you can maybe coach them to maybe, so that they see the relevance to the SDGs, maybe that they can be able to sell it like complying to the SDGs. So it's that kind of coaching role rather than indeed the top-down agenda, right? To impose farmers to do what we want. Sorry, I mean, I hope, not sure it's very helpful, but it's at least my first reaction to your question.
No, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, answer. I hadn't, it's more of like educating them of what the SDGs are and how they could be impacting, rather than telling them just to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Olga, for the question, and Sergi for the answer on that.
Thank you for the answer. Thanks.
Okay. Other thoughts or questions for Parker or Sergi?
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. So, these are the students from Seton Hill University in Pennsylvania, and they're doing fair trade campaign throughout the semester. And what they were talking about was just the fact that our university uses Aramark for food service, and what challenge that is in working with a food service company in having fair trade food items available on campus.
Yeah, as someone who works both, one who used to help to lead the Fair Trade College and Universities initiative, as well as now am on the opposite side and am working with the coffee companies that supply to groups like Aramark. Just a little bit of like, I guess advice would be to note that food service operators respond to demand from students. So if you all are able to in any way get a coherent statement or something that demonstrates that you have wide support from the student body, they will make any change that you request, like pretty much any change. And it's something where oftentimes those requests can have pretty big impacts, not just on your university, but on for other universities within the same system. So like another university down the road that might be using Aramark, they might also just be like, well, if we're going to switch to like fair trade, let's say coffee, tea, and bananas for Seton Hall, we might as well do it for this other university that's right nearby because it's just easier to manage the distribution that way. So just to note that that's like a huge, huge opportunity, I think, from you all. Really, sustainability in many ways is customer driven, and that's actually been a big focus of ours, is engaging the food service operators to make sure that they're pulling together comprehensive strategies to offer more options for sustainably sourced products across all of their systems. So the more it's kind of like that push and pull kind of thing. So you have to get both going to be able to make something like that happen.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we also invited the professor of political science and advisor for our Model UN club on campus to attend. So, if you hadn't done this webinar, we wouldn't have thought about doing sustainable development goals. And it might be something that we can do collaboratively with the Model UN students and with the students doing fair trade campaigns, so that we can have even more students advocating for fair trade on our campus. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it helps to contextualize fair trade, because it's such a nebulous thing sometimes for people, for them to see oh, here's how this rolls up into a much larger global initiative, and to make it very tangible. Super valuable.
Yeah, and thank you for that question, and hopefully we've got some good partnerships coming out of the SDGs connection for you all at Seton Hill. And I will just call out, we have an offer here for the Seton Hill folks from Krista Hicks, who is also on the webinar. Thank you, Krista, for offering your support. She works with Aramark at Arizona State University. So there's an offer to reach out, and we'll be happy to help you make that connection after this call. So we are at the end of our hour. I want to wrap things up and let everyone get on with your days. So once again, we'll, it would be a round of applause if anyone could hear us, but join me in thanking once again Parker and Sergi for their time and sharing the hour with us. And as we wrap up here, I just want to mention a couple other opportunities to get involved and keep your fair trade work going. We have one additional Fair Trade Month webinar coming up next week on authentic fair trade storytelling. So really excited to help you all put together your fair trade stories and how to use those to strengthen your advocacy. And then also coming up in March of 2019, we are hosting a national conference. Once again, we're very excited to bring folks together in Chicago in early March. More information will be coming out soon, but you can find that at conference.fairtradecampaigns.org. So thank you all for joining us. Please stay tuned for more from Fair Trade Campaigns, and I hope to see you all on another conversation soon.